EA's Star Wars Battlefront 2 is a good game. Ha! Wait, let me explain! Okay, while I understand where you're coming from with an opposing opinion due to the controversy, you know what? I agree. When I say that, my opinion is solely based on the game itself. Yet still, I know I'm in the minority, because while I was taking some time to reflect on the game itself, I had made some comments on some other reviews, simply stating that I thought the game was good, and as you can see here, I got a ton of backlash in the comments simply because I had a different opinion. This one right here is my favorite of the bunch. Controversy and EA's bad business practices aside though, is the game itself really that bad? That's it, review's over, next episode. All jokes aside though, having a different opinion is completely fine and justified. In fact, if I were you, I would think twice before trusting someone who can apparently breathe and talk in outer space. But just because I think it's a decent game, doesn't mean that there aren't a few negatives that need to be addressed. And yes, I will touch on the controversy. So, I would like to invite you to join me with an open mind as I analyze and review certain aspects from the game. And yes, this will be a lengthy one, so if you want to jump to hyperspace to a certain segment, then feel free to take a look at this table of contents I provided, and you can jump ahead at your own leisure. Anyway, that's enough talking, let's get started. Battlefront 2 is the successor to EA's previous take on the Star Wars shooter known as Battlefront. Released on November 17th of 2015, it received favorable yet mixed reviews as both fans and critics had different opinions on the matter concerning how they felt about the gameplay. As for my opinion on the first game, since I don't have any plans to review it in the future, I'll just throw in a quick 40-second bonus review. While it was nice to finally be able to experience battles online in an action-packed Star Wars shooter, the game itself was at first a subpar revival of the well-praised Battlefront series. In hindsight, the fact that EA gave this game a $50 season pass, which is almost the price of a whole game in addition to the cost of the game itself, that's pretty outrageous. While the end product after applying all add-ons is decent, if you take into account that at launch, there was a serious lack of initial level variety and content, I can't help but give EA's 2015 Battlefront 1 a rating of 6 out of 10 stars. Despite the flaws of the first game, however, it did well enough to spawn a sequel, which brings us to the topic of today's episode, EA's Battlefront 2. This was released 2 years later on November 17th of 2017, and it's safe to say that its launch was overshadowed by controversy when a player publicly posted a complaint about EA's price gouging that led to countless fed-up gamers banding together and ultimately resulted in EA earning the most disliked comment in Reddit history. While I'm not going to focus on this now, I will mention that at the game's initial launch, EA had chosen to apply some poorly planned pay-to-win concepts to help give players an extra advantage if they were willing to spend some hard-earned money. This would include being able to unlock characters faster and obtain more loot boxes. Yet I'll talk more about the game's progression soon. Although EA has responded after being shoved in the spotlight thanks to the frustrations of millions of gamers worldwide, the damage is already done. Even by removing the transactions at the time of this review, for now, it's unfortunate that a few greedy, corporate, snaggletooth vultures have clouded the efforts of what would otherwise be a pretty decent game. Yet having said all that, let's put the controversy aside as I finally break down my thoughts on the game itself. Let's start with the positive. Graphically, Battlefront 2 is a major step up from its predecessor, from the vibrant and lush colors used throughout all of the beautifully detailed maps, to the improved detailing on the character and weapon models used within the game, and even down to the way the characters move. Everything visually about this game just looks better. One thing I'd like to point out is that I really enjoyed seeing little visual extras thrown in, such as townspeople, innocent bystanders, and even random wildlife and creatures running away from the action in the background. To me, that was a little added touch that was both noticed and appreciated. Not to mention, check out the detailing on the planets. It's not something you focus on when in battle, but once you notice, it can be pretty distracting, but in a good way. Tack onto that the added ambiance of these superb sound effects and the familiar yet dazzling soundtrack from the films, and it's hard not to feel immersed once you pick up the controller. Not to mention, if you're an old school gamer and die-hard fan of Star Wars and have an ear for music, some of the tracks may have you feeling nostalgic. For example, during the loading screens, various themes from the musical library of Star Wars played to help pass the time. Yet one song in particular instantly reminded me of a game from my past. Sound familiar? That may be because this was the song chosen to act as the main title screen theme for the Nintendo 64 exclusive Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. Yet I'll talk more about that game on another episode. If I had to mention a negative about the visuals though, it would easily be that to me, the interface and menus look fairly bland and uninspired. You could argue that its simplicity is sleek and makes for a quicker ease of use, but to me, it just seems pretty basic. All that being said though, overall I think the look and sound of this game pack a punch, and I'd personally give them a rating of 9 out of 10 stars. Before digging into the core online multiplayer, allow me to start off by briefly talking about the overlooked split-screen arcade. For me personally, I have fond memories of my college days, gathering with friends in the dorm, popping in the old-school Battlefront 2 for the PlayStation 2, and engaging in epic 4-player split-screen battles. While it lacks the same arcade-like feel from the originals, the split-screen battles for EA's Battlefront 2 are still enjoyable. In fact, before I touched the online play, I duked it out one-on-one with my girlfriend, and you know what? We had a lot of fun, and she's not even a Star Wars fan. You can choose to battle against friends in a style similar to Heroes vs. Villains, or you can partake in co-op missions, which are basically rehashes of the single-player arcade missions. Nevertheless, there isn't anything particularly special here, as you probably won't be spending too much time with these modes. However, since many tend to overlook these features, I figured I'd take a moment to give them some recognition. And now, onto the main attraction, the online multiplayer. For starters though, let me just say that I am not necessarily a fan of online shooters. In fact, I can count on my hand the few that I've ever invested time in. It started with the PlayStation 3 exclusives Warhawk and Mag, then Overwatch, and finally Battlefront. Not necessarily a mainstream list, but just giving you an idea of where I'm coming from. Also, this will just be my thoughts on the experience of the multiplayer itself, as I'll be covering the progression and star cards later in this review. That said, I like the online multiplayer. In fact, I like it a lot, and it shows improvement over the previous title in almost every aspect. Right out of the box, there are more levels to explore and fight through. There's the inclusion of content and characters from the prequel trilogy and the newer films, and the mechanics just feel better. This is particularly true when it comes to the flying segments. The controls and piloting of the aircrafts feels much more polished and less disorienting, while still maintaining a level of challenge. Now, I will mention that while I have heard that many players aren't fond of the change in how you become a hero while playing on Galactic Assault, I think it's justified. If you are unaware, in Battlefront 1, you could become a hero by simply finding a hologram item. And honestly, that was more about luck and being in the right place at the right time. With Battlefront 2, however, you basically have to earn it by obtaining enough points to become a hero or villain, which honestly is the way it should be. The only downside to this could be that it rewards players that are already doing well by granting them the abilities of an even more powerful character, and thus making it less likely for someone else to have a chance, since you can't have the same character played by multiple people at once. However, while I can understand that point of view, my response to that would be #GetGood. Speaking of downsides, the larger maps are more open and allow more freedom than in the previous game, and while on one hand this aids in the feeling of immersion, it also can be a bit overwhelming when you first start playing, and can ultimately lead in some miscalculated deaths by flankers. So beginner beware, there's a bit of a learning curve here until you get the feel for the maps. I'll also mention that for now, there are some server lag and latency issues that have been hindering play for a lot of people. While this isn't uncommon with newly released games these days, it is a serious issue with this one that needs to be fixed. On that note though, EA has claimed to be working on this, so fingers crossed. Though I'm not going to lie, the lag can sometimes create some humorous situations. Also, while we're riding the negativity bus, I do feel that the game could do with a couple of extra modes here as well. At the time of this review, there are currently only 5, and while that's enough to keep the average player satisfied, pending future updates, I can see how this could eventually become a bit repetitive. Speaking of which, I noticed that heroes, particularly ones with lightsabers, don't do as much damage on regular soldiers as they did in Battlefront 1. For example, normally you could defeat a regular player with 1 to 2 swings of a lightsaber, whereas now it can take sometimes 2 to 3 swings instead. If this is really a tweak, and not just me, then I consider it a plus, as it requires the player to use a bit more skill and strategy to get the most out of their time as a hero or villain than in Battlefront 1. One change I don't like is how they remove the ability to alter the appearance of your soldier. So basically, while you're running around on a map, depending on the class that you choose, everyone pretty much looks the same, bringing a whole new meaning behind the phrase, Clone Wars. I'm hoping that they do something about this on a future update. Oh, and while minor, and also a common thing in games these days, just like in the first game, I like how you can quickly check your progress and how your stats compare to other players within the match. And I found myself doing this quite often to keep tabs on where I can improve and how many points I need before being able to unlock a vehicle or hero. The controls are improved as well in my own opinion, and the feel of running through the maps and attacking or defending just seems more spot on and well defined. It may take some getting used to, and you may even dislike the experience at first, especially if you're familiar with the controls of the first Battlefront, but give it some time and you'll likely warm up to it. Phew! So as you can see, I had a lot to say and cover, but overall, if you apply what I already mentioned about the graphics and sound, when it comes to playing through an actual match, the online multiplayer is a solid step up. Yes, I'm aware that there are better shooters out there, but in my opinion, this game is a fun experience that both looks and feels great. So, 8 out of 10 stars. The story mode actually exceeded my expectations, considering this is clearly a game with online multiplayer targeted as the primary game mode. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it almost has as much depth and length as the story from The Force Unleashed 2, and that was a full-priced $60 game when it was released. That being said, it's not comparable to The Last of Us or Persona 5 in terms of its plot. However, for what it is, in my opinion, it is well done, and for what it's worth, it is officially a part of the Star Wars canon. On that note, the story takes place between Episodes 6 and 7, basically right after the destruction of the second Death Star. This series of events that unfold helps to bridge the gaps on what occurred between the Rebels and the Empire from primarily a soldier's point of view. That's right. The bulk of the campaign involves you controlling an Imperial commander known as Iden Versio as she struggles to cope with the direction of the Empire after certain events unfold. Mild spoiler here, but throughout the campaign there are certain levels where you can play as a few heroes, which I thought was an interesting twist. However, I'm not sure how I feel about Luke Skywalker being an exterminator. What? Also, for what it's worth, a large portion of the achievements and trophies for the game come from the campaign, so if that's your cup of tea, then you won't be disappointed. Oh, and should you miss a collectible or achievement, fear not. There is a level select so you can filter through whichever level you want to play through without having to start over from the beginning. All in all, and keeping it as spoiler-free as possible, I'd highly recommend giving this campaign a playthrough should you end up buying the game. It's not worth picking up the game by itself though, but if you're a fan of Star Wars, you'll surely find it to be enjoyable. 7 out of 10 stars. Oh boy. Well, let me start off by quickly addressing the controversy of lockable characters. Yes, they did change the process. Yes, I did unlock Vader within a few hours, and by the time I completed the research for this video, I was actually able to unlock all of the characters. Now that I've mentioned that though, despite the changes made with the progression system after the successful resistance of gamers everywhere, it still is the worst aspect of this game and desperately needs some drastic changes. Having to pay to unlock a character faster is downright unacceptable, and unfortunately, a lot of other games do this. However, after a hotfix update that removed that feature, you now only unlock certain characters by using in-game credits that you earn simply by playing the game and meeting certain goals, and for the most part, I'm okay with that. I will say that what people are unaware of is right off the bat, you can still access all the characters without unlocking them by playing custom arcade matches either alone or in split screen. However, on the other hand, it would be nice to have access to them all right off the bat in online multiplayer, and honestly, this feels like a poor attempt at scraping the bottom of the barrel to throw in some earnable rewards and give off the illusion that the game has more depth than it really does in terms of features. Speaking of which, the game lacks when it comes to the amount of weapons available and the inclusion of worthwhile rewards, and this is one aspect I feel was better in the previous Battlefront game, and as the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So that begs the question, how come the developers felt they needed to fix it? That brings us to loot boxes. For me, having loot boxes in this type of game seems a bit out of place, and even if it did fit in, I don't agree with the route they took by having this be the main source of unlocking star cards. What are star cards? Well, star cards are items you can equip to your soldier, hero, or vehicle that give it extra perks and enhancements to give you an edge in battle. These are fine, but the way you obtain them is not. So going back on loot boxes, to me, this just feels like the developers were digging deep to try and give the reward system more depth, and ironically, the loot box system doesn't work well in this case without microtransactions. Why? Because their level up and credit earning system is broken. They obviously knew what they were doing here when initially applying microtransactions and allowing the player to pay for more loot boxes, because at this rate, paying real money for more is substantially quicker than trying to obtain them naturally. Not to mention, what you obtain within loot boxes is luck based on top of that, and I saw my first duplicate after opening only my 3rd crate. Believe it or not, there is a decent alternative, since aside from loot boxes, currently you can craft new star cards from scratch. That is at their lowest level if you want to go that route, but it's actually kind of fun. I mean, who doesn't love crafting, right? You can also upgrade existing star cards to become more powerful if you meet certain requirements, but some of those stipulations for upgrading are a bit stretched and require a lot of time rather than effort. Aside from the rewards earned by meeting certain goals, credits are, for now, the only way to obtain loot boxes, and you just don't earn them fast enough in my own opinion. So bottom line, if you take one thing out of everything I just said, loot boxes don't belong in this game, and the reward and progression system drastically needs to be updated and possibly overhauled completely. So 1 star out of 10. Are you still with me after that long-winded rant about loot boxes? I got a little worked up there, for sure, but that's because I'm very passionate when it comes to Star Wars, and the same can be said to the millions of fans who spoke up against the controversy that surrounded EA's use of microtransactions. However, that said, behind the mist of madness brought on by the negative press revolving around the controversy and the poor inclusion of loot boxes, hides a good game that I feel deserves to be enjoyed. Remember earlier when I mentioned the campaign mode had about as much depth as the Force Unleashed 2? I remember picking that game up when it was new, being excited after playing the first one and wanting to know what would occur next in the continuation of the story, yet to my disappointment, I beat the story within one night. I had just forked over a full $60 towards that game, and it was over almost faster than I could blink an eye. However, that game, though it did receive negative attention over its short length and diluted content, it earned higher ratings, and honestly, in my own opinion, if comparing the two, Battlefront 2 is far superior. So, if you were to ask me, is EA's Star Wars Battlefront 2 a good game, I would say yes. It's good, not great, but good, and if you can look past the controversy and find it within yourself to give it a chance, I think you may be surprised and find that you won't be as disappointed as you think. Plus, unless they go back on their word, which I would extremely advise against at this point, all DLC will be free for the game, with the first batch revolving around the new film, Star Wars The Last Jedi. With it comes a new hero and villain in the form of Finn and Captain Phasma, new maps, and additionally there are plans for an expansion on the campaign's story, which I must say is pretty unexpected and kind of cool. So while it's likely I'll cover some of these updates on this channel, if you're willing to give the game a chance, as you can see, there is a lot to look forward to in terms of content. That's why, when it's all said and done, while I do feel it is a solid 7 out of 10, I'm going to dock a point due to the awful progression and loot box mechanics. Not because of the controversy though, I'm rating the game itself, not EA. So, pending future updates, until we see what ends up happening with the progression system, my rating for Battlefront 2 is 6 out of 10 stars. So, have you been playing Battlefront 2 or plan to pick it up? Or maybe after watching you still think that the game itself is still bad. Hey, that's fine, but let me know in the comments down below. And also be sure to click that subscribe button if you haven't already for more content like this in the future, as I'll likely be covering some of the upcoming updates in the coming weeks. And those will be a lot shorter, by the way. But hey, that's it for this episode though. I'm That Bald Gamer, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.